Oh man, I wish we were over 200 hours in Balatro. I guess if you combined my mobile game playing, you'd get over 200 hours, so my street cred is still intact. If you've looked at the internet in the past year, you've probably heard of Balatro. It was the biggest indie game, I think, of last year. My personal game of the year for last year, for whatever that's worth. I wrote a piece about it in March, actually, on my blog, which this is going to be sort of a short video version of that essay. So if you've never played Balatro before, and you looked at this screen, even if you've never played Balatro before, you might be able to pick out, oh, this might be good. And the reason, or you might be able to say, this is decent, but this is better. And the reason you know that is because Balatro is poker, right? Balatro is just playing poker hands with what starts as a standard poker deck. I think a lot of the discourse about Balatro was really, let's say, ambivalent about this fact. The game has a, like, whatever the equivalent of a mature rating is in the UK, I believe. I don't know if it still does. Because of the fact that it looks like gambling, because it looks like poker. Some people say, you know, you have to get past the fact that it looks like poker in order to enjoy the roguelike underneath. What I would say in response to that is the fact that it is poker is part of what makes Balatro genius. And what I mean by that is most roguelikes, take for example Slay the Spire, probably the best example of the form, at least before Balatro. Slay the Spire has to spend a lot of time setting up basic mechanics. What does a card do? How many cards can you play? What would be a good card hand to play? What would be bad, etc. It has to set all this up because you've never seen any of this before. There's no real world analog. Well, there is for me, because when I was at PAX earlier this year, I bought the board game of Slay the Spire, which is actually a funny, like, reverse example of this, where I know how to play that because I played the video game. But in general, when you first start playing something like Slay the Spire, the game has to teach you how to play it, right? The game has to teach you what its cards do and what it means to play a hand or to play a round. When you start Balatro, you just have a deck of cards that is like any deck of cards in any game of poker, and you're playing hands that would be good in any game of poker. There are a lot of complicated rules about Balatro, obviously. Each of the jokers is basically its own rule that is selected randomly. There's the way you make cash, which changes based on which deck you're playing. There's the score counter, the chips and mult options. But even that is based on an understanding, chips in particular, based on sort of an understanding of playing poker at a casino table. What that gives Balatro is the ability to skip the part where it has to tutorialize its basics. And then what it gets to tutorialize instead is the fun part of a roguelike, which is the mixing and matching of interesting deck archetypes and different multipliers or wild cards. You are building something new and interesting almost every run, but you are doing it from a baseline that anybody who has played, that has played any kind of card game before is going to understand. And again, that's part of this game's genius. That's not to its detriment. That's why the game works as well as it does. Its core mechanics are nearly universally familiar. You draw cards, you assemble a blend of those cards that ranges from a high card to a royal flush, and the game never needs to explain that part of what it's doing. I think that's a really underrated part of why Balatro is so successful, and it's why some of the attempts to knock off Balatro's success have been doing similar things. Like, I think there's a roulette version of Balatro. There's a blackjack roguelike recently that resembles Balatro in a lot of ways. And that's an attempt to capture the same magic. But even within those, even the rules of blackjack is less arcane, I think, than poker, than 5-card stud poker, which is about as simple as playing cards gets. I'm going to play a terrible hand because I'm not paying enough attention to hit my blackboard properly. Balatro is a beautiful mix of presentation, UI. The song is obviously a banger. Everything about Balatro is made and crafted really well. But what it sits on top of is a foundation of a game that basically everybody in its possible audience has already played enough to understand almost intuitively. And intuitive grasp of gameplay mechanics is a really hard thing to get to, much less to be able to start with, before you've even had to train the player on what your game is and how it works. That's why Balatro is my game of the year, or was my game of the year for last year. That's why I think it has an enduring power that goes far beyond most roguelikes. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to go back to playing a bunch of hands that don't work at all with the jokers I've selected, and still win because I'm playing on a brand new save. There is nothing as satisfying as playing a lot of Balatro and then going back and starting a new save file and promptly winning a bunch of Balatro runs that are sloppy and stupid. It makes you feel like a card genius. I am a card genius.